The crater, to the untrained eye, seemed an oasis, a verdant painting amid the arid highlands of the northern reach. Wiry pines and weeds alone decorated the sheer mountains to the north, and to the south, the scrub plains spanned countless miles as the mountains died and gave way to the hungering maw of the desert. This circular break in the highland earth held at its center the only permanent source of water for some 40 miles, its clear blue depths some 400 or 500 yards across, glittering in the light of the sinking afternoon sun. The cenote was flanked by several thin outcrops of trees, which shaded a blanket of brown grass a hue greener than any of the other dusty patches blanketing the wilderness, all sheltered from the worst of the day's sun and wind by the cliffs which loomed above. Paradise it might have seemed to a staggering wanderer on the hills, but Tekolotl knew well what lurked behind the facade of that bottomless crater lake and its golden girdle of autumn wildflowers. It was the quiet that really unnerved him. Their trio had stricken camp on the hills overlooking the cenote just 2 nights prior, and it had taken him most of the second day to realize what had been keeping him awake at night. His bat-like ears now stood at full attention as he sat upon his makeshift bench of stone, honed on the still, cool water below, his nose twitching as he strained to pick out any murmur amongst the deafening quiet. Nothing reached him save the sheltered wind through the trees at his back and the screeching of a lonely vulture somewhere far above, all accented with the mundane scent of conifer sap. A stock-still image, lifeless as the grainy, colorless photographs one could develop on the bustling streets of the capital back home. "Talk me through it again," Tekolotl said, his icy eyes never leaving the water. Azotl snorted, wordlessly mocking his twin from his perch on a desiccated old log not far off, his own eyes also locked on the cenote. Tzolk'in glared over his shoulder from where he crouched out before them, his teacher's scorn turning Azotl's snout to the dirt in defeat. "Sunset is closing in," Tzolk'in said, as much to Azotl as to his brother. "Today we'll decide whether you are to be men or corpses. Stand up." Tekolotl and Azotl snapped to their feet in practiced unison, their boots crunching the dry earth as they advanced to flank their teacher at the cusp of a jagged, stony incline downward into the crater. Their guide, with all the authority of a Kalmakak drillmaster back home, waved them down into crouches at his side, and they fell into line. "The northern slope into the valley is your doorway," Tzolk'in instructed, arm outstretched to indicate the relatively gradual break in the cliffs far to their right. "The full moon will guide your feet. Once in the crater, you will make for the water." Their guide turned to Azotl, his amber glare giving no quarter. "Show me the tripwires, bold pup." Despite the venom, Azotl, ever the professional, kept cool under his superior's thumb, tracing with outstretched finger the route to the lakeside through the valley with studied grace. Tzolk'in nodded all the way, following his charge's planned path. Tekolotl ran and re-ran the maze of strewn boulders and wiry trees, marveling at how firm Azotl's grasp of the layout was and praying he would not bring disaster on his brother by some dreadful misstep once the hunt was underway. When it was his turn, Tekolotl traced the same route, wondering all the while whether the tripwires would be any less camouflaged once they were on the ground. The moon had better be bright. Tzolk'in rose to his full height as they finished, saying, "You'll pluck a wire near the lakeside, bait the devils into the open, and kill the first to reach you. The 4 gauges should be more than enough. The real trick will be keeping the fangs intact." The guide tapped the largest of his canines with a dark grin to accentuate his point before finishing. "Then it's into the water with you, until the rest of them give up and head home. I'll signal you once you're clear." Then it's just a matter of retrieving the trophy and slipping back out of the valley. It'll be cold down there after dark, Azotl chided, looking over to his brother. Hardly as cold as the grave, Tekolotl returned, waving his brother's words off. You'll need to swim a bit to keep warm, Tsonakat said. But don't move too much. We're far enough removed from the cenotes in the heartland that the Luska shouldn't be a worry. But who knows when a hungry one might be swimming the tunnels down below. Better to nurse a cold once we're all back in Tekolotl than die without a fight in the water. They both cooled at that, their eyes darting for the depths once more. The brothers had been too focused on the threat which lurked on land to even consider that a threat might lurk in the water. Seeming to sense the weight of their realization, Tsonakat's mood softened, and he clapped their shoulders as he rose to his feet again. Don't overthink this, boys. You're both of fine stock, sure to soak your sagas in the blood of Sholoshaidi's enemies on battlefields yet to be forged. You've nothing to fear but a dishonorable death, and I'd wager the Lord of War has bigger plans for you. Tsonakat's smile was the muted grin of a field officer who had seen a decade's campaigning, shrouded by laurels of loss which were only just porous enough to let his empathy shine through. He strode for the camp, the tall man's fading footfalls leaving the twins to their thoughts in the stifled hush of the dying day. I'll need all the help Harakwe can send me with you tagging along, Azotl said, nudging his brother's arm with his elbow. It was playful, more a jibe than a jab. We'll pray he's looking up at us from below then. Better him than the Luska, after all. Azotl chuckled, and Tekolotl cracked a smile, his canine showing for a moment as the threat of the silent crater seemed to recede. You'll do fine, Azotl said. Tsonakat's right, we shouldn't overthink it. In a week, we'll both be kicked back, firing up pipes in Tekolotl, lording it over the enlisted. Waiting all winter for the flower wars, you mean, Tekolotl said. It'll be spring before we get to put the rank to use. We'll survive. There's plenty liquor in the capital for the both of us. Tsonakat's voice cut into their exchange with the cruelty of a blade, his usually cool and calculated syllables unbridled in a way they'd not heard since meeting him when they'd set out from Kushkotlan some 5 days ago. The whole trek south, the ranger had been a paragon of refined expertise, seeming at one with the very land below his boots, at once the civil noble and the Wilderland wise man, a prime example of the eagle cast for which the province was famed. It only took one word to peel away the steely exterior and unveil the mortal, thrumming heart beating beneath. Iden. They were at his side in an instant, taking up watch alongside where Tsonakat crouched at the fire pit, their shotguns snatched up from among the tents. Their eyes struggled with the pines blanketing the mountainside nearby for a frenzied moment, grasping for the threat. It was keen Tekolotl that spotted the being first, but finding line of sight to the foe did nothing to calm his nerves. If anything, his panic soared, the drumbeat of his heart in his ears methodical and ever-sharpening. There, some 200 yards away, a hulking form stood in the shadowy boughs of a copse of trees, the trio's eyes picking out the reflection of the dying sun against the beast's own golden gaze. It was bipedal, like the men of Sholoshahidi, but towering and swollen with corded muscle, its bulk wreathed in scales hard as stone. Clothed in ragged, thick furs likely native to its homeland in the distant north, the intruder's crocodilian head twitched back and forth as it scented the air, the rumbling clatter of its inhalations audible even at considerable distance to their honed canine ears. Be ready, Tsonakat muttered, hand upon his rifle along the ground, more a psychological aid than a threat against so resilient a foe. Their standoff dragged on for an agonizing few seconds before with a final twitch of its clawed hands along the crude, oversized jezail or musket it carried. It spun for the incline and sped on hide-wrapped feet up the stony ground through the trees, away from its ancestral foes at the campsite. "Damn us to the skies," Sonakat breathed, his eyes wide. He hesitated a moment, stricken with disbelief, then burst into motion, grabbing up his pack and beginning to toss everything of use at hand into it with haphazard fury. "Gather up what you need, fast," he ordered, waving them both into motion. "There's more than one." "We have the 4 gauges, Azotl said, eyes narrowed at the trees, still reluctant to move. "We should stand and fight." Sonakat shoved him hard, making the wiry young soldier stumble. "Gather your things," the ranger reiterated. "Now." Azotl needed no more urging. He joined his brother in filling their packs, grabbing the food and water they would need for a flight back south into civilized lands. Ever the rebel, though, the fear in their guide fast being breathed into the teens did not stop him from talking. "Where are we going?" "To a post 2 days southwest through the wastes," Sonakat answered, his eyes darting for the pines. "We have no way of knowing how many are up there. We need to warn the Legion." "There hasn't been a real raiding party from up north in centuries," Azotl said, more musing to himself than to Sonakat. "They must be desperate in the Eidenlands." Sonakat didn't pay the statement any heed, backing out of the camp with his hunting rifle readied as he waved the hastily packed brothers after him. Tekolotl looked back at the camp, wondering at how little they were bringing. "What about the tents?" "Worry about your life," Sonakat said, leading them at a jog along the edge of the crater towards the southern descent and the flatlands beyond. "We won't be sleeping anytime soon, unless it's with the gods beneath the earth." The pair stayed silent then, pacing their guide and trying not to panic, an effort made all the more unattainable for Tekolotl with each wide-eyed scan their leader made of the sparse forests on the mountain. Tekolotl had heard tales, of course, and had seen anatomical and historical illustrations at the academy, but to actually see the cold-blooded Goliaths of the north, the ancient antithesis of the Empire, seemed almost supernatural. It was enough to strike the fear of prey into the young Sholoshaishans, suddenly at one with rabbits beneath the gaze of wolves. When the thud of their boots and the fire of their breathing really got underway, they could all perceive an echo of their motions along the hillside, unseen pursuers flitting from tree to tree, both to the rear and to their flank. On a family excursion to the jungles of the Southlands in his youth, Tekolotl had heard a plantation's small herd of water buffalo surge through the undergrowth, and the thunder of reptilian feet through the nettles and sparse growth of the forest brought their image to mind. As he had those many years ago, Azotl was well ahead of his brother in the sprint, almost keeping pace with the lithe ranger, and Tekolotl had to strain to keep within 8 or 10 paces of them. It did not matter how fast he was if he was still last in line, he thought, something close to grim humor finding him amidst the din of pursuit. Then the trees to their left broke, and hell spilled forth like molten slag onto the sandy ground above the crater. 2 came into view, their towering forms splitting young pines and drumming up low clouds of dust as they ran, their thick tails wavering out behind them to keep balance on the move. They shouted, if that was indeed the proper word for such alien vocalizations, to the group farther behind, the growling notes of the death song echoing up and down the mountains around them. The Aiden were close, and as Sonakat slowed before him and flitted his head around in a desperate bid for more options, it finally began to sink in that they would not be able to slip away. As Azotl fiddled with his shotgun and Tekolotl swung his own gun off his shoulder in turn, Sonakat waved them over toward a treacherous dip in the wall of the canyon, a dry creek bed that would see no water until the spring melt brought the sparse snow down from the mountain to water the cenote. "Here," Sonakat called, shouldering his own rifle. "Get the 4 gauges ready." They took up positions at his side as he chambered around and placed it with effortless skill into the chest of one of the 2 advancing reptiles, eliciting barely a flinch from the thundering foe as a thin stream of red marked the pale hides it wore. Less than 100 yards now. "Aim high, to kill once they're close," Sonnakat ordered. "Then flee down the creek to the valley. Let the Tekolotl have the others." It took Tekolotl only a second to understand, his widening eyes never leaving the approaching Iden. They had only 4 shells, 2 for each shotgun, a sportsman's kit for a single, decisive kill each. The other pack in pursuit, only now rushing out of the trees further back toward the camp, was too numerous. 4 more had emerged from the trees, some of these holding antique and makeshift firearms. They needed to work with what they had. Again, Sonnakat's old rifle cracked, and again a puff of sanguine left the hide of the reptile, this time grazing the top of its stony skull and sending the stream weeping down over its eye. Still, they did not hesitate. 30 yards now, their tightened footfalls jolting the ground. "Fire," Sonnakat said, himself letting fly into the twice-stricken monster. Azotl struck true, the head and shoulders of the untouched beast vanishing in a cloud of smoke and ruined flesh as its corpse tumbled to the dry dirt with a delayed thud, the report of the heavy gun likely audible many miles away across the southern flats. Tekolotl was not so fortunate. The kick of the weapon, a fierce blow one could never be truly prepared for, nearly bowled him off his legs in his nervous fluster, and the shot went wide, maiming the injured warrior's right arm but doing little to slow its charge. Everything after that happened so fast, Tekolotl didn't truly process it until much, much later. Azotl, almost as soon as his shot was made, fell to one knee in pain, a clunky report off to their side telling Tekolotl that the junk guns of the lagging Iden had started firing. Sonnakat, displaying a bravery that would have shamed kings, flipped his bolt action around and slid forward with it raised above his head like a club, making to heave into the lizard's skull. Its own club, a crude thing of whittled log, found the dog first, his arm and ribs shattered with the force of a moving train as he was tossed broken through the air to roll like a child's toy across the ground, already seeping blood from his mouth and eyes as he spasmed to a halt. Azotl groaned as he lunged for his dropped gun and found his torn leg too ruined to allow the move, falling just short of the stock. Tekolotl, shouldering his own gun once more, allowed the distant fire of the shoddy weapons of the foe to die away, not worrying about their fast-growing volume. He paced forward, almost within arm's reach of the lizard, and hove in its torso with his final shell the second its golden gaze met his. The 10-foot giant fell in on itself with a stuttering rasp and left Tekolotl coated in its thin, blackish-red lifeblood. Another roar of wordless protest from his brother against the pain brought him back to reality, and Tekolotl was fast at his side, helping Azotl to balance his weight on his good leg. "The gun," Azotl said, still focused on the weapon. Tekolotl tossed his own empty gun aside and took up the weapon before looking to Sonnakat. "Gone," Azotl said, Tekolotl reaching that conclusion just as Azotl spoke the word. He gave Azotl his shoulder, beginning to make for the creek, but Azotl hesitated. "Leave me up here, with the gun," Azotl protested. "You go on, Tekolotl." A sharp crack as some chunk of scattershot flung from the pursuing Iden struck a nearby boulder made them both flinch. But all the while, Tekolotl dragged his brother along down the mouth of the fast-steepening creek, grunting under his added weight. Azotl had always been the stronger of the two. "You aren't dead yet," Tekolotl managed, the pair skidding down a bank of gravel with grace only necessity could muster. Azotl didn't protest, and soon the twins were out of sight down the winding trail of the skeletal stream, their pursuers still precious seconds behind on the cliff at their backs. Down below, the crater seemed more ominous than ever, sunset casting its last light into the forsaken crag in the fashion of a sputtering candle, mocking those who would seek such a graveyard as shelter. Azotl struggled, blood wetting his black trouser leg and staining the cooling stone beneath their boots. But neither had time to do more than glance at the wound between strained, hobbling lunges and slides along the staggering creek. Tekolot's brother, ever the silent paragon under duress, did nothing to communicate the pain he must be in save grit his teeth when the jolting route through the rock grew particularly brutal. Neither spoke, their ears perked for the noise of the Aiden up above, only now sounding their rage in a gutter-born tongue of growls and hissing bellows before clattering down the cliff after them, invisible through the intervening boulders, inclines, and scraggly scrub. With the scaled wolves of the northern wastes at their tails, the pair made the crater floor in a matter of minutes, their boots finding the dusty ground of the stream's banks a welcome relief from the punishing gravel. Above, the moon was all that remained to light the way, and before them, the boulders, grass, and long dead trees of the valley floor offered nothing save a death trap. It was there, before the final plunge, that Azotl finally hesitated, glancing back up the crater wall as if his glare might slow the beasts thundering in their footsteps somewhere up above. "If I misstep, leave me," Azotl said. "There'll be no time to cut me free." "You won't misstep," Tekolotl grunted, shoving forward and dragging his brother along with him. "Shut up and move." Azotl didn't protest. They moved on under Tekolotl's direction, weaving through the stone and fallen logs with a care brought on by far more than the ill-suited moonlight and an injured leg. Every few moments, a broad stride needed to be made over grayish-white wires as thin as a finger, stretched taut through the dust and browned grass of the crater floor. Azotl always waiting for his brother to cross before lunging over in a hop to be caught by his uninjured twin. Their progress was slowed by the tripwires despite the methodical approach they took to the cenote, and every minute that passed drew the howling Aiden at their backs closer to the valley floor, their hearts thudding in their chests all the faster with each snorting snarl from the cliffs behind. It was as they drew into the last 20 yards or so of open ground before the cenote's edge dropped off into darkness that they heard the report of a crude Aiden weapon from far behind, the clatter of its scattered shrapnel on the stones around them driving them into a reflexive crouch. Trying not to let the blind fire rattle him, Tekolotl managed with shaking hands to guide Azotl over the next tripwire, more shots ringing out through the dark as they shuffled along. As he followed, a stone the size of his head thrummed past Tekolotl in the dark, the force of the displaced air telling him exactly how close he had come to death. He lurched, his reflexive withdrawal unavoidable in the panicked heat of the pursuit, and when he next tried to lift his leg, he found it restrained by his boot, wriggling against a phantom grip he didn't need to see to understand. "Run," Tekolotl told Azotl, waving him on toward the cenote. "Get to safety." Azotl bent and made for his brother's boot, hands outstretched, but Tekolotl shoved him away, pointing again to the water beyond. "They're coming!" Another spread of poorly aimed shrapnel peppered the stone and sand all around, but it was a more silent doom Azotl looked for as he backed away, scanning the stony no-man's land, eyes wide as he fought the urge to flee under the Reaper's scythe now closing in around them. Tekolotl set to work on his boot, making to slip his foot out and continue unshot, yelling once more for his brother to flee. Finally, eyes ever darting back for Tekolotl, he made for the water, limping in short bursts, blood from his open wound etching his path upon the soil in his wake. With a final jolt of nervous energy, Tekolotl pulled free, stumbling after Azotl with shotgun in hand. Somewhere behind, the Aiden were yowling their fury back up the cliff, Their attention turned toward targets the Sholoshaitians could well imagine from their staggering position at the crater's center. Welcome to Sholoshaiti, Tekolotl thought to himself, a grin twitching at the corner of his mouth. Then, the expression was stolen from his face in its infancy as he laid eyes on the quarry they had come all these many miles to stalk. It moved with a graceful silence which seemed to mock its bulk, its 8 legs gliding with elegant poise over rock and log as it banked across Tekolot's field of vision from right to left, closing with the limping Azotl with eerie, soundless speed. Fully as large as the rhinos which stomped the jungles of the southern archipelagos, its many eyes glinted almost as hungrily as the fangs twitching with anticipation beneath its wavering chelicera limbs. At first, Tekolotl sped up, looking to catch Azotl and escape into the water before the predator could close the gap. But as second ground out into grueling seconds, it became obvious the wounded canine would not make the drop. Tekolotl pounded out a few last desperate strides, shouldered his weapon with terror's cool coordination, and fired the juddering weapon's last shell. The spider lurched, the force of the shot sending it stumbling off course with its legs flailing out on all sides in a vain attempt to stabilize. It twitched a storm of dying motions in the sand, its icy silence complete all through the drama, but Tekolotl was not able to revel in the kill. The rapturous vibrations of the shot had stirred up motion behind him, and he turned to find that 2 more of the giant arachnids were reared up on hind legs at his rear, stalled in startled confusion just yards away by the noise of the discharge. Wasting no time, Tekolotl sprinted for the cenote's edge, where Azotl was sliding down towards the water with eyes made heavy under growing blood loss. "Hurry," Tekolotl urged, tossing aside the spent gun and breathlessly jumping down onto the rocky embankment, tugging Azotl down behind him. Azotl grunted through the agony, but did his best to shift his weight and aid his brother, and within a few short moments, the pair were bobbing in the cool water of the cobalt-blue hole, the chill of the lake stealing what little breath remained from Tekolotl as he kicked with wild abandon to move the 2 of them out from the deadly shore. Once bobbing in the water, Azotl struggling one-legged to keep afloat, the 2 watched a flock of the silent arachnids drawn in such terrible haste from their burrows in the crater walls skitter and twitch along the shore, staring outward at prey now beyond their reach and shuddering with anticipation of a feast which wouldn't come. It was not long before, frustrated, they seethed wraith-like back through the rocks and logs toward the raging cries of the Aiden over the sand, whose war song still rung with wild abandon over the star-kissed stones of the valley. Finally beginning to catch his breath, Tekolotl turned his attention fully to Azotl, making to help him out of his overcoat. Azotl pushed away through the still, yawning pool as best he could, though, and it was then, in the gibbous light of that uncaring night, that Tekolotl saw how clouded the water about them had become by his brother's thrashing. Too much, he thought. He needed no medical training to know something was very wrong. Still, he persisted, his eyes finding Azotl's once more, refusing to break from them as he swam for his lifelong companion. "Let me get the coat," Tekolotl managed between breaths. "It's only going to make it harder to stay up, now that it's soaked." "Tekolotl," Azotl said, his voice a rattling tremor, void of the stern steel it had always carried. It was an alien noise, as foreign to Tekolotl's honed ears as the reptilian gutter tongue of the Aiden. He pulled up short, frozen a foot or 2 away. "Don't. I'm done. Must have been an artery." Tekolotl's mirror shivered and stammered. It was a shakiness only partly to do with the chill of the nocturnal deep below. Azotl blinked hard, as if clearing his eyes, bobbing on the surface, his squint making it seem as if he was trying to spot his twin from far away, a distant shape on a fading horizon. You managed that Tekolotl all right, though. God, Spider. What a joke. There was mirth in his voice, but it was hard to detect. You'll make it if you stop chattering, Tekolotl protested, trying to draw in close again. Azotl waved him away, and though the motion was weak, Tekolotl couldn't bring himself to challenge it. The Luska will take me if the bleeding can't. It'd be better if I went down to them. Save them the trouble. Azotl grinned, his skin already the sickly, cruel gray of dried limestone through the dark. Tekolotl, though he could never grasp how he managed in the moment, returned the gesture. Fill my pockets with stone, from the side. That and the boots will be more than enough. Tekolotl, moving as an automaton, kicked over to the shore, his eyes wary of any lingering Tekolotl. He found several sizable stones, kicked over to Azotl, and began placing them in the pouches of his coat. The whole process was done with his eyes cast downward into the gaping blackness of the world maw below, the moonbeams around them dancing just 30 or 40 feet through the blood-tainted crystalline water before being eaten by the shadow of the endless tunnel. Only when he finished could he meet Azotl's gaze again. Lucky we're over the grave, Azotl murmured, his voice almost a whisper. Otherwise you'd have to drag me home to a cenote. I could take you home, Tekolotl said. I could send you down the pits outside Tekolotl, where you'd be with family. It shocked Tekolotl how level his voice felt. He knew his eyes betrayed the turmoil which boiled just behind that placid tone. Azotl shook his head, his eyes drooping as if he were nodding off. There's only one underworld. I'll find the way. Azotl was almost motionless now. Only the aid of his brother, holding him close and kicking with spasmodic frenzy, kept his head above the wine-colored stew of blood and cave-sprung water around them. It was a good death. I should have let you die fighting on the ridge, like you wanted. You were always the best of us. Tekolotl said the words just a hand's width from his brother's face, but he didn't stir. He still breathed, but the rasps were shallow, labored, fading. Tekolotl let go and kicked away, and in moments, Azotl had slipped under, drifting with slow and methodical grace down through the masking cloud of his spent blood, and into the final stretch of visible murk beneath. Not once did he twitch in opposition to the depths. As his brother dipped into the black reaches of the cenote, a strange worry, odd even as Tekolotl considered it, occurred to Tekolotl, and he made certain to recall the face of Azotl. Its form, so close a mirror to his own, was slightly broader at the jaw, slightly sharper along the brow. Would he remember it come morning? What would he tell their father come his return alone to the Empire's capital, his namesake missing from amongst his sons? Would he even see Tepeclan's bustling streets again? He found in the deafening silence that settled after his brother joined his ancestors in the cool depths below that the Aiden across the valley had fallen quiet, either dragged into lairs for feeding or flown up the creek to safety in the open wastes beyond. Kicking off his lone boot and tossing it to the rocky shore before shrugging off his heavy coat and letting it float free on the cenote's softly rippling surface, he made for a rocky outcrop near the edge of the pit and sat upon it, only feeling the exhaustion of the night in his limbs and over his shoulders as his body was allowed to halt its restless motion and dwell in the future it had desperately carved for itself. His eyes toward the shore, ever mindful in case a silent counterattack by the spiders of the valley drove him into deeper water once again. Tekolotl waited. It would be a long night under the hateful, mocking gaze of the moon, and he had sworn not to show the hells above a single tear. Tears could wait until Tepeclan. What mattered now was ensuring Azot's warrior's death did not go forgotten by all save he and Harakwe. The sun rose over a valley, picked clean of any corpses save the spider near the cenote, which slowed Tekolot's path to the heights only long enough for him to extract a fang as proof of his conquest before continuing on his way. His trapped boot abandoned, he climbed the creek on cautious feet, praying Tsonakat's boots were still intact. He crested the final rise, squinting against the mournful morning's light upon the yellowed grass and sandy stone, and made to retrieve them from their departed guide. The ranger had been partially eaten as a token of disrespect, and the pair of enemy corpses that should have rested before him warming in the nascent day were missing, a sure sign that at least one of the Aiden had made it out alive. He moved quickly, making the 7-pointed sign of the Triskelion over his chest before removing Tsonakat's boots and slipping them on, not relishing the thought of a grueling hike out in oversized shoes. Offering a quick apology and prayer beneath his breath that he could not afford the time to take Tsonakat's remains to be properly put to rest in the cenote, he promised to pay penance in the hereafter for his disrespect. He then asked Tsonakat's blessing before taking up his saw-bladed makwahwit, the only weapon which had been left by the ravening lizards from the north. Storing his trophy fang in his pack and swinging it to his shoulder, it was only as he made to go that he noticed the shape along the tree line, standing hunched less than 100 yards away. 2 stone cairns, made in the fashion of its brutal homeland over the northern border, rested not far off. What Tekolot had initially taken to be eager anticipation was, on closer inspection, sickly exhaustion. Even at his distance, he could see that its muddy scales had been tarnished by thin trickles of its black blood, and that ruptures in its torso bore the vague purplish swelling of poison. Even the mighty biology of the great enemy could not fight the venom of the god spider. It was on borrowed time. That did nothing to dull the fire in its golden eyes. Tekolot remained stone still for a long moment, waiting to see what move the creature would make. When it finally shrugged off the Jezzail it carried upon its shoulder, he initially thought it to be an act of surrender. Then, his heart swelled as the giant extended its clawed hands to either side and fell into a crouch, advancing at a slow pace, favoring its uninjured side, eyes never leaving the foe. Tekolot almost saluted the thing. This was how one was meant to meet death. He dropped his pack, letting it clatter to the dry earth, and rolled his shoulders, trying to limber up after a night spent hunched and shivering. He took up Tsonakat's toothed sword, wielding the weapon two-handed, as he would have during fencing matches at the academy, and fell into a mirrored position, the pair of them eating the intervening ground with methodical, hungry anticipation. Tekolot could likely have run. He was healthy, if tired, and the Aiden was ill, racked with the chilling venom of death's hand, its otherworldly stamina deadened. What would that have made him? Azot, look up from below. This glory should have been yours. Tekolot's prayer was muttered, but it drew a confused grimace, if it could be described in such a way, from the crocodilian opponent. He grinned. Yesterday, a hunter. Today, a soldier. He swung the makwahwit wide and charged.